Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Random. Berto Willis. Today we have the honor of speaking to Charlotte Dennett. Who is Charlotte Dennett? Charlotte Dennett is the Beirut-born daughter of America's first master spy in the Middle East, Daniel Dennett. She is an investigative reporter and the author of the best-selling book called "Follow the Pipelines." Again, I repeat, follow the pipelines. With what's going on in Ukraine, we're going to have a lot to talk about. Charlotte Dennett, welcome once again to Politics and Right. How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Great to be on your show.
Well, look, it's great. It's great to have you. Anyway, first, before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an investigative journalist and author of 3 books. The latest one, Follow the Pipelines, and I'm an attorney. I'm an attorney to pay the bills. If you're an investigative journalist, you sure aren't going to count a lot on bringing in a lot of money unless you're super famous, of course. So you need 2 professions in order to carry on your passion.
Well, you know what? It seems like you have a good one here, especially with what we're going through with Ukraine. So let's get started this way. Russia decides to invade Ukraine. In your humble opinion, without first going into the pipeline thing, what's the real genesis of that war? And let me just warn you, I had a Ukrainian citizen on one of my shows a couple of weeks ago who pretty much says Russia is all to be blamed. We have always been an independent republic with our own history, and the Russians just came to be a part of us because of invasive history. That's the genesis of that's a synopsis of what he said. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm still boning up on the whole history of Ukraine, but I can tell you that there's a long history between Russia and Ukraine, and which is why Russia is trying to recapture it. But that's not the only reason. I am looking at that whole war through the perspective of it's being an energy war. And from that perspective, I would refer people to a Rand Corporation study that was published in 2000, and it's about Ukraine and natural gas. And what that story says is that Ukraine has a good amount of natural gas, and we need to develop it as a way to wean the world or Europe off of Russian natural gas. And the whole thing sort of
wait, I need to stop you there. I need to stop you there because you just added a perspective that I never, ever had. I think you're telling me that the reason we've gone in all hog with Ukraine is you're saying that Ukraine has gas that to date is unexploited, and that we want to be the one to exploit it, but Russia wants to go in there to be the exploiter. Is that correct? Am I understanding your
it's close. Okay. It's very close. Ukraine has the second largest natural gas deposits in Europe, but they're unexploited. But that explains this whole rush into Ukraine. In 2014, there was a lot of commotion in there, and eventually a pro-Russian president was removed by the CIA. And
I remember that.
Yes, and eventually replaced by Zelensky. But here's the Rand report. This is Ukraine and the Caspian, 2000. This is before Bush starts doing all his stuff in that area. And in fact, Dick Cheney, head of Halliburton, was very interested in Ukraine and the Caspian Sea. And the Caspian Sea was looked upon also as a great reservoir of natural gas. And the whole idea was to get away from the dependency on Middle East oil because there was too much conflict. And, oil cannot be exploited and pipelines can't be built. They can't be financed if there's a conflict going on. So they started to look to other places. And so Ukraine was looked at way back in 2000. Now, let's just come up to 2014. No, let's not do that. I'm sorry. We have to go even further back. This is how we uncover the origin of a crisis. You go back in history, and what I
Right.
do is I keep going back to find the origin. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1992, there was a promise made by the United States that if the Soviet Union was dissolved and the former Soviet republics were to go independent, NATO would not advance toward the Soviet Union 1 inch. They broke the promise. And that has now been well established. NATO has moved in on all these different countries and gotten closer and closer to the border with Russia. So there are those
I need to pause you right
yeah,
there. And the pause goes as follows. I've heard that as well, but I don't know the history. Was that something that's documented, written, or was that verbal agreements?
it was a written agreement.
Okay.
And I believe James Baker, he was former, what was he,
He was the
Secretary of, yeah,
Secretary of State for
yeah,
George Bush.
yeah, he made that promise and broke it. And so when people say that this is an unprovoked war, that's what they say in the United States, that is not really true. It's not it is a provoked war in many people's opinion. And in fact, there were warnings by State Department officials that if NATO powers continue to encroach further closer to the Soviet Union, there's going to, I mean, Russia, there's going to be a problem, as it turns out. Now, this does not necessarily justify the aggression that Russia did or the brutality of the attacks.
And I must pause
Fact
you there.
is,
I must pause you there again too, because in telling these stories as an independent journalist myself, what I like to make sure to do is provide context. Independent nations should have the independence to associate with anyone they want to associate. Do you agree with that, though, right?
yes, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, yeah, and so Russia, by invading, violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But people also need to realize that before he invaded, he kept asking for NATO assurances that first of all, that they were not going to take in Ukraine as part of NATO. He wanted those assurances, and the assurances were not given. So he is going to go around and claim, uh, once people have some historical context, he's going to try to justify what he did. In my humble opinion, I see a plague on both their houses, because
Mhm.
what I see this as a energy war first and
And
foremost
I want to first of all,
between two superpowers.
I'd like to exploit that with you, or rather explore that with you. But what I want to remove from the context, in my opinion at least,
Sure.
is that whatever, that in another country wanting to become in alliance with another should not be an excuse for any other country to invade the other. I mean, let me also tell you though, America behaves the same way because again, if somebody when Russia was attempting to come to put their stuff in Cuba, if you will. We didn't like them
Yeah.
coming to Cuba. We didn't. In fact, I think we have something called where we have dominance over the American hemisphere, if you will. So I mean, I'm not saying that America would not behave that way, but I think both America and Russia, in my opinion, would be wrong if they're the ones that are saying you can't be allied with X, Y, and Z. But
Yeah.
so, all right. So let's go ahead and talk about the gist of your book, however, which has to do a lot with this being an energy war, or this imply that this is an energy war with pipelines, etc. Why don't you make that case?
Well, I have been tracking pipeline wars for decades, and that goes back to the role of my father for the Central Intelligence Group, immediate predecessor to the CIA, when he was sent into Saudi Arabia. If I can just give you a little bit of this
Sure.
historical context, it will explain how I got to Ukraine very briefly. His role was to determine the route of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. And this was in 1947. And his mission was to figure out what its route was going to be, because it was going to travel overland and have a terminal point on the Mediterranean Sea. And either the terminal point was going to be Palestine, interestingly, or Lebanon, which was right next door. And the more I looked at it, I also had my father's last report before he was killed, and I'll get to that briefly, and his last letter home. And from his last report, I learned there's a tremendous amount of intrigue going on at the time. America, by virtue of it having an exclusive concession of Saudi oil, was becoming a superpower in the Middle East and
Right.
also in the world. And America's wartime allies, the French and the British, were very concerned about this because they had had a monopoly of control over the Middle East, particularly the British. But the French, they had control of Lebanon and Syria, for instance. British had control over Palestine, Jordan. So there was a lot of intrigue. And I learned from declassified reports, because I sued the CIA, that my father's job when he was sent over there in 1944 was to, quote unquote, protect oil at all costs. That is a very important sentence, because it gets applied over and over and over again during the Cold War, going all the way up to the endless wars in the Middle East. So once I had learned that, and that my father was spying on our allies, then I began to understand the great game. And it's a ruthless game, and it's all about getting control of oil. So, and why control of oil? Because oil is the fuel of the military, which most people are not told or reminded of. Even now with this Ukraine situation, you'll see all sorts of maneuverings with who's going to get natural gas and who's going to get access, but they don't say that oil is the fuel of the military. And when you, and the thing about the Ukraine war is what had once been hidden from view, censored out, is pretty blatant now. I don't think many people would dispute with me that energy has something to do, energy security has something to do with this war. But still, when you see the black billowing smoke coming out of oil depots that were hit and refineries that were hit, that's because it is a military target and it's going to hurt either side's advances. Which it did. And in fact, that convoy of troops,
they were stuck because they were out of oil. Yeah,
they ran out of oil. Now, what every major power knows is that Germany lost World War I and World War II because their military ran out of gas. Can you believe it? That's what happened. So that's why this is so intense, and it's still going on. And the other thing that brought me to Ukraine, because from the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, which I followed up to the endless wars, I found pipeline connections to the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and I can elaborate. But getting to Ukraine, one of the first Russian-owned projects that was sanctioned by the US was a major pipeline. It's called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And it has been completed after many efforts by the US to prevent it from happening. And it is to carry natural gas under the Baltic Sea and going to Germany. And from there, it would be distributed. The reason the US didn't want that is because that would have made Europe even more reliant on Russian natural gas. And so America's role in all of this thing is to weaken Russia and wean Europe off of its dependence on natural gas. And that is all very well documented. So having looked at what they did with Nord Stream 2, then I looked at all these maps. Maps are very crucial. And if you go to my website, followthepipelines.com, you'll see some very interesting maps on Ukraine. The Russians control the pipelines that transit through Ukraine. And they, up till now, they're still sending natural gas through there because it was under contract. They have to make good on their contract before the war began. But those are aging pipelines, and the United States wants to develop alternative pipeline routes. And there have been efforts in the past that have succeeded. There's a pipeline that is called the BTC pipeline that was built during the, let's see, I think it was in the 1990s. And that runs from Baku through to, I can never pronounce it, Tbilisi, and ending up in Turkey and Seyhan. I have a map of that in my book. That was a way of avoiding Russia. And it's all these bypass efforts, you know, we're going to bypass Russia and Russia's going to bypass the US. And it's this incredible pipeline wars that are going on right now. So let's see, what else can I say about Ukraine? Why is Putin focusing on Eastern Ukraine? Because that
Donbass?
is,
Yeah.
yes, that is where most of the natural gas is. Okay, that is my opinion. And why seize Crimea earlier? Crimea sits in the Black Sea. The Black Sea is loaded with oil and natural gas. A lot of it is still not exploited. Russia has built 2 pipelines under the Black Sea, and the US doesn't like that at all. And by getting a hold of Crimea, they have even more access to the riches of the Black Sea. And I have a map in my book about that. So it really is. The other aspect is that the United States has been renewing its pumping of oil and natural gas as a result of the war in Ukraine, because they're worried that Russia will shut off the gas supplies to Europe. So that you got to find alternatives. And the fracked gas people, these tend to be more the smaller oil and natural gas companies. These are not the majors.
Mm-hmm.
They have been pining to get in to that whole region of Eastern Europe. They were pining to get into Afghanistan too, and Iraq. And Dick Cheney was one of the main people to do that. Dick Cheney is the vice president to Bush, was surveying the whole region, the Caspian, and also he was looking at Ukraine. And interestingly enough, Victoria Nuland, who is
That caught in
today.
Ukraine, yeah.
Oh, you know about her?
Of course, in Ukraine, she's one of the ones who sort of created sort of a malaise between. I think she got caught by the Russians, if I'm mistaken, saying some untoward things on her cell, right?
It got leaked. They were
Right.
talking about who they were going to replace as the what Russian president, pro-Russian president,
Right.
was going to be replaced with. And that
Right.
got on the phone. She was also seen handing out candy to the demonstrators
Right.
against his regime. She was very much in favor of a regime change, and she worked for Dick Cheney
Right.
during the Iraq war years, and she's married to Robert Kagan, who's a key neoconservative. But I would say that it's not just the neoconservatives that have had their eyes on Ukraine. It's also, well, certainly Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was Carter's national security advisor, he was looking through his concept of the grand chessboard, which is a book he wrote, about establishing American dominance in the world as a single superpower. And so he's a sort of a neoliberal. He comes out of the Rockefeller
They're all
camp.
neoliberals, the ones who run our country that provide. I mean, that's why whether it's Obama or it's Bush, our oil policy remains the same, and what we do overseas remain the same. One of the reasons I love having you on talking about this, and again, I don't want to be here giving misinformation about Russia, Ukraine, the United States, or anything. So I wanted somebody who actually knows what's going on. Your father was an ex-spy who worked on this, on all the things on towards or otherwise that's done by not only the United States, but by France, by UK, by Russia, by all of them. He knows all He knows where all the dead bodies were, and you also have a lot of documentation to where the dead bodies were. Interestingly, interestingly, let me tell you what I want. One of the reasons I wanted you here to let my audience see. You know, we have these fights among Republicans and Democrats and all of that as if we are anywhere in the game, and we fight on their behalves of who to be the master or the control of entities, when the reality is they're all in one boat fighting with each other to get maximization of their profits, while we all, Mademoiselle Dennett and all of us, suffer for what they do when they play their big games. Would you agree with any of that I've said?
I certainly would agree with it. Sometimes there are differences within them. I consider the neoliberal Rockefeller camp as being more sophisticated,
Hmm.
and they often rely more on economic pressure than going into a region with a sledgehammer. I think that they may not have gone into Iraq the way the U.S. did
Under Bush.
so
Yeah.
blatantly. Bush was more allied with the neocons, and well, because of Cheney, of course. And they had been angling, as I said, these smaller ones. I mean, Bush Zapata oil, that was minor league, but they saw riches to be made, and they just, went in full hog. The neoliberal camp is more sophisticated, generally speaking. But I want to return to Brzezinski. Guess who the U.S. ambassador to Poland is? It's his son.
His son, I
Okay, what's
know.
he doing there?
Well,
You have
he
to
has a
ask
name,
yourself.
right?
Yeah, and then I found this great quote from Henry Kissinger, who was a protege of Nelson Rockefeller, who I wrote about in a previous book.
Right.
And Kissinger said, if you control the oil, you control the world.
It's
So
true.
that's what it's all about. They may have differences of approaches, but it seems to me that it's all sort of come together with Ukraine. You got the neocons and the neoliberals sort of working together, it would seem to me. And
It
the main goal is to weaken Russia. And I mean, Biden blew it. He said it. He said it.
Yes,
We
he
want
said it.
regime change. And then it
Here's
was
the
like,
thing.
no, it's not regime change. Come on. Putin
Again,
knows they want to get rid of him. So
again, Miss Dennett, I think one of the reasons that we want every American understanding these stories as well is because it was amazing to me how quickly Biden asked for $33 billion dollars after he had gotten $14 billion dollars. He has no problems getting it from either Democrats or Republicans. But you know, it goes a bit further. He asked for $33 billion dollars and they said, no, no, Biden, you can have $40 billion
40
dollars
billion.
to give
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
to the Ukraine. And then you ask the question, wait a minute, aren't we having problems giving folks health care? Aren't our kids having problem paying their student debt? Aren't we having problems providing family leave for those who need to take care and protect families? But we can always find the money to do the things that Miss Dennett talks about, and that is fund the pipeline wars. Miss
Yeah.
Dennett, why don't you give me a closure that summarizes what we are actually seeing in this world and what we should, as an educated citizenry, try to mitigate going forward?
Well, we have to understand the role of pipeline politics and pipelines and oil in all the major conflicts in the world. And I have said that I see the war in Ukraine as becoming the mother of all energy wars if it further escalates, which it appears to be doing. And if we get into, God forbid, a nuclear confrontation. And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of developing alternative energy, moving away from fossil fuels. The Europeans are doing it. This war has scared the Jesus out of them.
Yeah,
They
the Germany doubled its defense budget too, right?
Yeah, and I mean, they're really worried. So they're still doing that. But in the U.S., certainly the independents and the gas frackers are making hay out of it. And drill baby drill is back. a lot of Biden's promises are going down the drain. He's leasing public lands now to allow for drilling. I don't think he wanted that necessarily, but the pressure of the energy companies is just enormous. So what we've got to do is further educate ourselves about this horrible role that oil has to do with war, let alone climate change. Okay. And then once we totally understand that, we've got to save the planet, and we've got to just do everything we can for future generations to get off fossil fuels. I think there will be fewer wars if that happens. Look what's happening today. The market's down 1,000, right? And it's because, as we were speaking, it's because of this war in Ukraine. They're starting to get worried, and it's a very serious situation. So I appreciate your allowing me to expound on my geopolitical analysis here.
Charlotte Dennett. We need more Charlotte Dennetts out there telling the true story. Too often we rely on news bites that don't really go into detail, and people are easily fooled by the misinformation, both by the neoliberals and the neocons. So I thank you so kindly, Charlotte Dennett, for having been on Politics Done Right.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.